I now call to speak Janet Pythian, who is our prospective parliamentary candidate for the constituency of Brent South in London.
Good morning. I am not a politician, and I do not aspire to be one. Although interested, I have never before been active or involved in politics. I am now active and involved. Until recently, I worked for an international investment bank and travelled a great deal. During a trip to Moscow, which coincided with Easter, I experienced something very moving and powerful. It was the first time for a very long time that Russians had been allowed to celebrate Easter openly, and they really did celebrate. They filled the churches, they queued in the snow to have their food blessed, and they gathered in thousands in Red Square for a midnight service. Whether or not they were deeply religious, they were exercising their freedom of choice. Democracy is precious, but our politicians have been giving away our sovereignty without telling us and without asking us. This issue is critical to the way we live, to the future of Britain, and to every European nation. I want to be part of Europe, but what type of Europe? Not one where unelected bureaucrats have the power to tell us how to live. I want the right to self-government, but also a Europe where, working together, we can do better. So let us fight for the right to choose. Thank you. I take pleasure in introducing our next speaker, Luke Johnson. Although still in his early 30s, Luke has had an extremely successful business career as chairman of public company Pizza Express plc, and as a director of companies in the TV industry, employment services business, as well as a US transport firm. He is also a writer. He has published 6 books and writes for a column for one of our weekly major newspapers. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Luke Johnson, our parliamentary candidate for the constituency of Hammersmith and Fulham.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, Terry Smith a short while ago quoted Benjamin Franklin in saying, "In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes." Had he been alive today, he might have observed that nothing can be more certain than that Brussels wants to tax us. For the vision of the Eurocrats is truly Napoleonic. Governments provide services, and their action improves or damages the quality of life. They collect taxes in order to pay for this action. The governments that offer the best quality of life and the best services for the lowest taxation are rewarded with the creative forces and the capital which are necessary for job creation. The governments pursuing a federalist vision of Europe want to eliminate such fiscal competition. If they are successful, then they would no longer be under pressure to improve services. They could keep taxes high without fear of being undercut by neighbouring countries. These governments dream, therefore, of a tax cartel. With tax harmonised across the EU, continental governments would no longer need to exercise self-discipline in order to encourage investment and growth. Countries such as the UK, with a tax burden which is low in international terms, would lose their advantage overnight. No wonder our European rivals are keen on the idea. The Eurocrats want to iron out the distortions caused by the different fiscal systems across Europe. Centralising the decision-making process on tax will be the icing on the cake, the final act to strip autonomy from the nation-state. The agenda is clear. First, states give up control over trade and tariff policy. Next comes centralised decision-making on monetary policy and exchange rates. And once nations have given up the fight here, they are to lose their power over taxation and expenditure, the only remaining avenue through which they could pursue independent social or economic policies. Contrast this with an alternative vision, one in which each nation-state orders its tax affairs autonomously, strives to provide the optimum level of state service for the lowest level of taxation, and is judged by the capital markets in terms of investment flows. Such an approach would encourage companies to eliminate waste within their state systems, and it is for this very reason that the Eurocrats cannot countenance it. At the moment, there is recognition among the member states that tax and expenditure policy is something essential to their sovereignty. Indeed, how can it be otherwise? For a society's decision on the level of tax it pays reflects its people's views on fairness and feasibility, not to mention its economic and social structures. We should never forget that the right to raise taxation is a fundamental right of the nation itself, indeed, a hallmark of sovereignty. It is for this reason, in contrast to most of the single market programme, that decisions on taxation have always had to be made by unanimity. In other words, with the agreement of every member state in the community. And what does the Commission think of the need for unanimity? It cannot stand it. In March this year, Mario Monti, the European Commissioner responsible for tax issues, launched a new initiative aimed at tax harmonisation. He called on the member states to discuss taxation in a wider perspective and announced that the Commission's aim was, and I quote, to sound the alarm bells and trigger the debate. On another occasion, Mr. Monti suggested that, and I quote, it is time to drop the erroneous idea that national capitals have retained total tax sovereignty. They have long since given in to market forces, and it is time for us to come to terms with that. And such sentiments are not just the preserve of the Commission. Listen to Hans Tietmeyer, the president of Germany's Bundesbank, who declared last year that, and I quote, it is an illusion to think that states can hold on to their autonomy over taxation policy. Indeed, a key objective of Commissioner Monti at the current Intergovernmental Conference is to replace the need for unanimity on tax by qualified majority voting, thereby forcing us to accept the tax decisions taken by others. The Commission can no longer contain its frustration with the autonomy of member states. But beware, ladies and gentlemen, for it is not only harmonised taxes that figure in the dreams of the Eurocrats. Their ambitions go much further. They have their sights set on community taxes, on the direct taxation of people in Europe. In an interview earlier this year, the European Commissioner for Budgets, Finland's Erkki Liikanen, commented, it would be interesting to introduce something that everyone could identify with as a kind of community tax. And at their 1995 party congress in Madrid, the European People's Party, the Christian Democrat grouping in the European Parliament, called for a separate European tax, a motion supported by the British Conservative MEPs present. However, I believe, as I'm sure you do, that we cannot accept taxation without representation. We should learn from the experience of the United States. In the US, the federal government was unable to impose income tax on its citizens until early this century, save for a brief period during the American Civil War. Whilst it lacked the power to tax directly, the states were able to retain their independence. However, in a momentous decision in 1913, the 16th Amendment to the US Constitution gave the federal government the power to tax American citizens directly, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. Thus began the transformation of the Commonwealth of States into a centralized nation-state, with Washington developing into the bloated Leviathan that we see today. The Eurocrats have learnt from the American example, and their ambitions are clear. They intend to follow the example of Washington. The member states will be humiliated and would be left to serve the interests of Brussels, which would develop into a grotesque monster. And what, you may be wondering, will be the impact of harmonised taxes or a community tax on the UK? Let me tell you. According to the OECD in Paris, the UK has one of the lowest tax bites in the European Union. In 1994, our government took as tax revenue an amount equal to 34% of the UK's gross domestic product. For our EU partners, the average tax bite was 43% of GDP. The OECD's figures confirm that if the UK's taxes were to be harmonised up to this average level, then the cost to the UK will be £60 billion, equivalent to more than £1,000 for every person in the UK. Ladies and gentlemen, the time has come for us to raise our voices against the Eurocrats. We must fight for the right to determine our own destiny and not surrender to the centralising ambitions of the European Commission. Thank you.